Today we have Linda Olson, who most of you probably know. She gave a wonderful talk for us. I was looking back at the date. It was in February 2020, which seems so long ago now. She gave it was a joint presentation with the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. We had a great crowd. One of our last in-person things. I think that was our last in-person meeting. And she spoke about her research into Isaac Peckham, the lighthouse keeper of St. Simon's Island. So you'll know she's a genealogist, a historian, manages to take all the research and present it in an entertaining way. So today she's going to talk to us about finding famous Revolutionary War people who are buried in Georgia using FindaGrave, which has been her COVID project. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Linda. I'm going to mute everyone. And then at the end, she'll turn it back to me and I will ask you all to unmute for a question and answer.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. About once a year, I do a presentation for the Sons of the American Revolution. And as Stacy said, I've been working a lot with FindaGrave during COVID. And so I suggested that I look up what famous revolutionary people are buried in Georgia. So let me first spend a little bit of time for those who aren't familiar with FindaGrave about what FindaGrave is. FindaGrave is a free website that you can go to and find if your family graves are on there or famous people are buried there. So you just go to findagrave.com and the first thing you do is you start your search. And you put the information that you know about the person you're looking for. First name, last name, date of birth, and where you think they're buried. And you can also search on partial last names, nicknames, maiden names, or even if you just want to look at famous people, you can do that. If you don't find a member of your family that you want to put on, you can add a memorial. And I've got over 2,000 memorials, which I have added to FindaGrave. Now, if I'm going through this information on FindaGrave too fast, there is a tutorial on FindaGrave that you can go to and find out more about FindaGrave. You can refine your search once you've found the search results come back, you can refine it. If you got too little information, you can delete some of the things, or if you got too much, you can add some things. So you can refine your search to find exactly the memorial you're looking for. And then when you find the memorial, you would just click on the one that you want, and it brings you right to the memorial. And it sometimes people have uploaded a photo of the grave. You can save this memorial to, if you have Ancestry, you can save it to your Ancestry.com tree or to a virtual cemetery that you've created on FindaGrave. For example, I have a virtual cemetery on FindaGrave of famous revolutionary people buried in Georgia, so I can just go right to that. You can also, if the gravestone is not on the memorial and you're not in the area to take a picture of that gravestone, and I use this for my family who was from Canada. I knew they were buried there, but couldn't get to Canada to take a picture of the gravestone. You can ask someone to take a picture for you. And in that case, it was up the next day. You can also add people's photos if you want a photo of the person if you want. And here's an example how I've used mine. This is my father, Zenny Olson. I put his high school picture up there. And I also put his gravestone. And this is his obituary that I got from the newspaper. And it says that he was internationally recognized for his research in fluid power control. And I actually put a picture of the servo valve that he created. He's created over 200 of these servo valves. So in my mind, he's a famous guy. But according to FindaGrave, they define famous. They say, don't confuse importance with fame. And even though every ancestor is important and every veteran deserves to be remembered, it doesn't mean they're famous. So to be considered famous in FindaGrave, you have to be well known outside your local community. And you can, they have a claim to fame section. And you can go in there and look up actors and actresses as well as military figures. But I wanted to find people who were in the American Revolutionary War and buried in Georgia and were famous. So how did I get to that? So I went, the Revolutionary War was 1775 to 1783. So I put in that the people were born after 1700 and before 1870. The cemetery that they're in was in Georgia, and I clicked on famous. I ended up with 36 results. And I put together a spreadsheet, which Stacy has put on our website. And the spreadsheet lists the person's name, where they're born, where they died, where they're buried, their location, and their memorial number. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these 36 people. And if you want to find out more, you can go on FindaGrave. Just put that memorial number in, and you'll get right to their grave site. So our first one is David Meriwether, and he's in Athens. So Meriwether County was named after him. Now there's 159 counties in Georgia. So a lot of them are named after these famous people. So little housekeeping here, whenever the name of the person is in italics, that means there is a county named after them. And also a little more housekeeping, every time I go to a different town, you will show where you are, so you know. I'm going to spend a lot of time in Augusta, a lot of time in Savannah, but when I move to a different town, right after the person's name, it'll let you know where you are. So David Meriwether was a lieutenant in the New Jersey Continental Army, and he came to Georgia during the siege of Savannah. And we can see his memorial here. And what I thought was interesting about him, that and great advantage to FindaGrave, is that he is buried in a private residence backyard in Athens. I went to as many of these cemeteries as I could, but obviously I couldn't go to this one because it's in someone's backyard. So the cemetery is there. He's buried with his, there's only 3 graves there, and he's buried with his wife and his son. So here's where all the graves that we're going to visit. And it's not going to take 9 hours and 18 minutes. We've got about 40 minutes left of the presentation. And we're going to start at Stephen Hurd Cemetery. We're going to go down to Augusta. Now, Augusta was a capital of Georgia. It was our second capital of Georgia. So as I said, I'm going to spend a lot of time there. Then we're going to scoot over to Macon and Milledgeville. And of course, Milledgeville was a capital of Georgia. Then we'll go to Louisville, which was another capital of Georgia. And we'll end up in Savannah, which was Georgia's first capital. There are no famous revolutionary people buried in Atlanta, so we will not be going to our current capital of Atlanta. So let's start up at the Stephen Hurd Cemetery. Stephen Hurd is buried in Alberton, Hurd County. He was a captain in the French and Indian War with George Washington, and from that war, he was awarded land in Georgia. He was in the Revolutionary War. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Georgia militia. And while he fought, loyalists first forced his wife and daughter out of their house into the snow, and they froze to death. But he kept on fighting, and he was in the famous Battle of Kettle Creek. Well, he was governor of Georgia for about from 1780 to 1781. And when he was governor, the loyalists captured him, and they planned to hang him. So here's a picture of him. And as you can see, he's not a very big guy. But he had a servant, Mammy Kate, and she was 6 feet tall and very strong. Well, Mammy Kate convinced his jailer to let her visit Stephen Hurd right before he was going to, the day before he was going to get hung. She had a basket of food and clothes for him. And she took the food and clothes out of the basket, and she put Stephen Hurd into the basket and covered him with a blanket. And then she walked right out past the gate with the basket on her head. I told you she was a strong woman. Right outside the gate was her husband, Danny Kate, and he whisked them off into safety. Now, Danny Kate and Mammy Kate were the first Black woman to be honored by Georgia's Sons of the American Revolution and the Daughters of the American Revolution. all three of them are buried at Stephen Hurd Cemetery, and there's 78 graves in that cemetery. Our next stop is going to be Elijah Clark, and he's in Lincolnton. He's the hero of the Hornet's Nest. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Georgia militia. He was a leader of the frontier guerrillas, and he inflicted a heavy toll on the British and Loyalists. He died in 1799 in Augusta, and he was bankrupt. They moved his body in 1955, and this is a common theme you'll hear throughout the presentation, that they move famous people's bodies around. So he was moved in 1955 to Elijah Clark State Park. So he's buried there with his wife and 2 daughters. When he died in 1799, he died bankrupt. What I didn't know about Elijah Clark was in 1790, there was a Treaty of New York. And during the American Revolution, everything that's in the white and down here to Savannah on the coast, that was all that consisted of Georgia. The rest was Creek Indian territory. And you can see from this map, slowly, the Creek Indians succeeded the land. So here we have Augusta, here we have Lincolnton. And in the Treaty of New York in 1790, the federal government, really without advising Georgia at all, said, okay, Creek Indians, we want to take this land that's in the orange, and everything else you can keep. So the Creeks ceded this land. In the pink area, there were white settlers. They were told they needed to leave. A lot of white settlers weren't happy with that, including Elijah Clark. So in May of 1794, Clark and his followers seized the Creek land, and they called it the Trans-Oconee Republic. And Clark vowed to defend it with his life. Well, the federal government was ballistic about this. They couldn't believe it. So in September 1st, 1794, 1,200 Georgia militia troops arrived. And a lot of them knew Clark from the American Revolution. And they said, Clark, what are you thinking? So Clark ended up surrendering, but he ended up losing all credibility on both sides. Our next stop is going to be in Augusta. We're going to see John Millage. He's buried in Somerville Cemetery. It's also called the political graveyard. I mentioned that Augusta was the capital from 1785 to 1795. This is an absolutely gorgeous cemetery. It's right down the street from the Augusta National Golf Course, where, of course, the Masters was just held. John Millage was, in 1775, during the Revolution, he took Governor James Wright a prisoner, and he helped seize 600 pounds of gunpowder. He was a colonel in the Georgia militia. Well, a little factoid they didn't know about him is during the American Revolution, he developed a way to extract oil from a benny seed, which is like a type of sesame seed. And that oil was a substitute for olive oil during the war. Next up is right downtown in Augusta at the Signers Monument, which was created for our 3 signers of the American Revolution, and George Walton is there. He was a member of the Second Continental Congress. He was in the Georgia militia colonel, and in 1778 he was shot and he was captured in the Battle of Savannah. He was released in 1779 and became governor of Georgia. Well, they moved his body. He was originally buried at his nephew's farm right outside Augusta. And this is what the farm and the cemetery looks like today. So good thing they moved George Walton. Also buried in this, at the Signers Monument is Lyman Hall. Lyman Hall was born in Connecticut, and he moved to Midway, Georgia in 1760. He was also in the Second Continental Congress. And in 1778, the British destroyed his home as they went through Midway to Savannah and his rice plantation. And Hall and his family escaped to Connecticut, and they stayed in Connecticut until the end of the war. When he returned to Georgia, he became governor. And in 1790, after he was done with his term as governor, he bought a farm near Augusta, and that's where he was died, and he was buried on his farm. Well, when they built the Signers Monument in 1858, they moved his body to the signer's monument. They didn't know where Button Gwinnett, the third signer's body, was, so they put Lyman Hall's wife's body in Button Gwinnett's place. Well, they had Lyman's original gravestone, as you see here, and that was sent to Center Street Cemetery in Wallingford, Connecticut. And it is called a cenotaph. And a cenotaph is a marker within a cemetery placed in honor of a person whose remains are buried elsewhere. Our next one, we're going to go to St. Paul's Episcopal Church Cemetery in Augusta. It was originally, St. Paul's Episcopal Church was right next to the Colonial Fort in Augusta, which was built by General Olson. And during the American Revolution, the British held it, and it was called Fort Cornwallis. Well, in 1785, when it was held by the British, there was a siege of Augusta, and the Patriots attacked, and it was an unsuccessful attack, and they were buried where they fell, which was right outside by the churchyard. Well, a year later, Lighthorse Harry Lee captured the fort, but the church was burnt down. Well, in 1820, the church was rebuilt, and this is a picture of it. Right, it was rebuilt right on the foundation, and it is surrounded by the cemetery. And here we see William Few's grave. Who was William Few? Well, he left North Carolina after his brother was hung by loyalists. He joined the Georgia militia, and he was a bold guerrilla war commander. Now, in 1784, he signed the Constitution for Georgia, along with Abraham Baldwin, who is buried in D.C. And in 1789, he was Georgia's first senator, along with James Gunn, and I'll talk about James Gunn in a little bit. In 1779, he moved to New York. His wife was from New York, and he actually died in there, but died in New York. And in 1973, the then governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, asked that his remains be moved to Georgia. Also in the church is Robert Forsyth. He was a captain in Lighthorse Harry Lee's cavalry. He was down in Georgia during the war, and in 1783 he returned to Virginia. And in 1785 he moved back to Georgia. A lot of the Revolutionary War men received land in Georgia after the war. So a lot of them came down, fought from Virginia and other places, and then moved back to Georgia when they received their land grants. Well, George Washington had him be our first U.S. Marshal of Georgia in 1789. Well, as U.S. Marshal in 1794, he went to arrest a man called Beverly Allen. Well, Allen saw him coming down the road, and he hid on the second floor in the bedroom. Well, Forsyth knocks on the door of the bedroom, and Allen shoots right at the door and hits him right in the head. Forsyth is killed instantly. Allen escapes and was never found. So Forsyth has the dubious honor of being the first U.S. Marshal killed in the line of duty. He died at the age of 40, and he left a widow and two sons, one of whom was John Forsyth, and John Forsyth is what Forsyth County is named after. Our next one is George Matthews. He's buried right next to Forsyth. He was a brigadier general in the Continental Army. Well, in 1777 in Brandywine, he was captured. This picture shows that he marched right into the British lines, and all his men followed him, and all of them were captured. George Washington was not happy with him. He had him be a POW for 4 years. He was not anxious to get this guy out of being a POW. And when he did in 1781, George Washington sent himself to fight. He didn't even want to see the guy. Well, after the war, George Matthews petitioned the state of Georgia for 1,900 acres, which he got. He was governor twice in Georgia, And while he was governor, he actually supported Elijah Clark and the Trans-Oconee Republic. So we shouldn't be surprised that in 1812, he pretty much did a similar thing. He captured Fernandina, Florida, with his a group of people, and it was called the Patriot War of East Florida. He said he was a spy for James Madison and that he was going to capture Mobile and Pensacola next. Well, this is 1812. James Madison said, hey, I'm going to get a war with England. I don't need to get Spain involved. To this day, we don't really know if James Madison had told him it was okay or not. But at the time, James Madison totally denied it. Matthews set off to Washington, D.C. to set James Madison straight, but he never got there. He got malaria and he stopped in Augusta, and he died there and he was buried there. Next, we're going to go to the Augusta City Cemetery, and we're going to see William Glasscock. He's the rebel counselor. He was a lawyer and a Georgia Speaker of the House. For a period of time, he did act as governor. Now, where he's buried is also known as the Magnolia Cemetery, and the roads are lined with magnolias. And you can see that. Here's his grave here, and right down here. And then it's just lined with magnolias. It's a beautiful 60 acres. But he's the only famous American Revolutionary person buried there. Our next up is his son, Thomas Glasscock. He was called the hero in battle. He was a brigadier general in the Continental Army, and he was twice a POW. He's buried at the Glasscock family farm in Old Savannah Road, Augusta. So here's a picture of the house in the early 1900s, but the house and the cemetery are gone. So I wasn't able to go to that grave. Next, we're going to go see John Twiggs. He was called the Savior of Georgia. He was born in 1750 in Maryland and came in 1760 to Georgia. In the Georgia militia, he was a lieutenant, and he rose to be a major general. In 1782, he drove the British out of Georgia, and he quelled the Creek Indian allies. I went to his cemetery. It is on his family farm. He was awarded 1,500 acres, and he died in 1816. So I crawled through all these weeds to get a picture of his gravestone. And you see how small his gravestone is, because even though it's just outside Augusta, at that time was considered a frontier area, and it was difficult to get stones there. But just 40 years later, this is his son's grave, and it's much larger. Our next stop is to see his brother-in-law, David Emanuel, in Burke County. He was a colonel in the Georgia militia, and he was the scout for John Twiggs, and he was captured by the Loyalists and escaped. He was our 24th governor. His claim to fame is he's the least known governor. We don't know anything about him. They don't know where exactly he was born. They don't know what religion he was, and he was a governor. So I know you can't read this plaque, but it pretty much says it all. He died in 1808, and David Emanuel was a gallant Revolutionary War soldier, governor in 1801, was a resident, and is believed to be buried in Burke County. They don't even know where he was buried. Our next stop is Tenneville. That's where Jared Irwin is buried. He was a colonel in the militia, and he fought with his father and his 3 brothers. He received land grants in Washington County. Here's a picture of Washington County today. And he was a general in 1794 in the Georgia militia, and he was twice governor. Well, I love it that FindaGrave gives you GPS, where they are in GPS, because this was a tough one to find. Even though down at the end of the street, they have a sign about him. And FindaGrave gave directions. It says go 0.6 miles on a dirt road and walk 50 yards. They had a picture of where you go in the 50 yards. I went back and forth on that road several times trying to look for the path. And I said, okay, this is 6.5. Let's just walk back there. Walked 50 yards, saw it clearing, brushed all these leaves away. And there I saw his grave. This guy was twice governor of Georgia. There's 12 graves there, and they include his 3 brothers. So you can see why they move these famous people, because it's easy to have their graves be lost. But this is, if you're ever in the area, this is worthwhile seeing. Well, we're halfway through. So we've been up to Stephen Hurd, went down and Tenneville, and you can see that further in that we're getting to the center of Georgia, we're getting more into hearing about people that received land after the Revolution. Our next stop is going to be Macon. And it was actually called Fort Hawkins before it was called Macon. And it was called Fort Hawkins after Colonel Benjamin Hawkins. He's the man that coined the phrase, God willing and the creek don't rise. He's not referring to a stream. He's referring to the Creek Indians. He was on George Washington's staff as a French translator, but he was good at multiple languages, including Indian languages. So that's why George Washington had him be the U.S. Indian agent for tribes south of the Ohio River, huge territory. But in 1803, he settled on 8,000 acres right in the Creek Agency Reserve, because it was all about the creeks at that time. And that is where he died in 1816. He's buried right at the end of Benjamin Hawkins Road in Roberta, which is just outside Macon. And the Daughters of the American Revolution have erected this really nice monument to him. Our next stop is Milledgeville. Thomas Carnes. And I mentioned that Milledgeville was the capital of Georgia. He's buried in Memory Hill. There's 6,000 graves. They have a beautiful, you can do a walking tour of the cemetery, but he's the only famous Revolutionary War person there. And it's a really small grave. It's hidden right here. He was on the Maryland line in the Continental Army. He was in the US Congress and judge. What I thought was interesting about him was when he was a judge in 1806, he was put on the commission for Georgia-North Carolina border dispute. It's a 12-mile wide acre right here, and you can see it over here. I've marked it. And it caused the war, the Walton War in 1804. There was actually 2 battles, and 1 person died. Well, the commission ruled that it should be part of North Carolina. Well, and some of you may have heard of this. In 1971, Georgia declared it had authority over this strip of land. The North Carolina governor responded, and he called the National Guard out to defend this orphan strip of land. Just as oh, okay, Georgia backed down at that one after the National Guard was sent out. Our next stop is going to be at the Revolutionary War Cemetery at Louisville, which was the capital of Georgia in 1796 to 1807. James Gunn was a captain in the 1st Continental Dragoons, and he came to Georgia with General Anthony Wayne to help free Savannah from the British. This guy had no respect for the people that were above him. And in fact, in 1789, he ran against his old boss, General Anthony Wayne, for the U.S. Senate seat. He won. So he was one of Georgia's first U.S. senators, along with William Few. To show you how much he had no regard for his superiors, during the war in 1782, he was in Savannah, and he traded his army horse for 2 horses and a slave for his own use. Well, Major General Nathaniel Greene charged him with improperly disposing of public property and brought him in front of the board of officers. Well, they looked at the case and they said, it's okay. Well, Greene was not satisfied. He sent the matter to Congress, and Congress deemed that Gunn needed to replace the horse. Well, Greene didn't forget it. After the war, in 1785, he challenged Greene to a duel. And Greene says, no way am I going to fight you for something that happened during the war. Forget it. Well, James Gunn responded that he would attack Greene whenever they met, to which Nathaniel Greene responded, I always carry pistols. Well, they never met. Greene died before they had a chance to meet. Let's go to Savannah, our first capital, and we're going to go to Colonial Park Cemetery. It was an active cemetery from 1750 to 1853, and it was originally 18 acres. It's now 6 acres. So some of those acres are under the Savannah streets because it's right in downtown Savannah. There were 9,000 graves. It has 1,000 graves today. We're going to go, you're going to meet 10 famous Revolutionary War people there, but 3 don't have graves. The first one that doesn't have a grave is William Gibbons. He was a millionaire. Actually, he was a multi-millionaire, and he was a continental congressman, but there is no grave for him. And another person that doesn't have a grave is John Selby. He was the first pastor of the Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah. And in 1766, he was a strong critic of the Stamp Act. You can see here's his sermon here. So he sounded like he'd be a good bet to send to the Second Congressional Congress. Well, while he's up there, he opposes independence. The people of Georgia branded him a traitor and banished him. He went up to South Carolina, but when the British regained their control of Savannah in 1778, he returned to Savannah. He died in Savannah in 1781, fully believing that the Patriots would lose the war. William Pierce does not have a grave. He was an aide-de-camp for Nathaniel Greene, and in 1781, he bore dispatches from the Etowah Springs victory. And for that, Congress presented him this beautiful sword. It's a French-style sword, and these type swords were only given to 15 officers. One side has the code of the U.S., the other side is inscribed from Congress to the recipient. And only 10 of these swords still exist today. Pierce's descent has the sword, but the blade is broken off. Next is Archibald Bullock. In 1776, he was the first president chief of Georgia. Basically, independent Georgia, he was our first governor. When Georgia was facing invasion from the British in February 22nd, 1777, the Georgia Council of Safety gave him full executive powers. Basically, they made him a dictator. Well, 2 days later, he died of unknown causes. Some speculate that he was poisoned because he was such a dictator. He does have a grave, and here it is. Well, what's interesting about him is that in 1894, Teddy Roosevelt named his son Archibald after his great-great-grandfather. So here's Teddy, and they do kind of look alike around the nose and the mouth. Our next one is McIntosh. And I always thought that McIntosh County was named after him, but it was actually named after the whole McIntosh family. He's buried at Colonial Cemetery, and of course what he's famous for is his duel with Button Gwinnett, where he actually killed, where Button Gwinnett died 3 days later after the duel. Well, they're dueling distance apart, about 15 paces away is Button Gwinnett's grave. Now, Savannah really feels they have Button Gwinnett's bones, but they were sent to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian says they are not his bones, so this grave is a cenotaph. The interesting thing about Button Gwinnett is they're not really sure what he looked like. He died so unexpectedly, and his signature is one of the rarest and most valuable of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Recently, it sold for $800,000. Nearby is Colonel Joseph Habersham. He was Lackham McIntosh's second in the Button Gwinnett duel. He was twice captured in the fall of Savannah and in Charleston. And in 1795, Washington appointed him to the U.S. Postmaster General. At the time, the Postmaster General was the second highest paid U.S. government official after the president. and here's his tomb. He's buried in his tomb along with his brother, John Habersham. He was with them at Savannah and Charleston, so he was twice captured and exchanged. And in 1785, he was elected to the Continental Congress. Near them is their cousin, Joseph Clay. He was in the Continental Army. What I thought was interesting about him was often when they mentioned him, they mentioned his wife. And we know that the wives were there, right there in battle. And his wife, Anne, was recognized for the care of American soldiers after the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. So it was nice to see that she got recognized. She was right there with him. And you don't see that too often, but the women were right with their men. And she's buried right with him in Colonial Park Cemetery. Also is Samuel Albert. He was a commander of the Georgia militia in the Continental Line. He was governor in 1785, and he was buried at Ray Plantation just outside Savannah on top of an Indian mountain, and he was buried in his full uniform as seen here. Well, they excavated the mound about 100 years later, and they found bones. Initially, they thought they were Indian bones, but they had the military buttons on them, so they said they're Samuel Albert's. They crated him up and they just put him in storage. About 20 years or so, in 1924, they reburied him with full honors in Colonial Cemetery, and this is where he is today. Next, we go to Johnson Square, and we see Nathaniel Greene. Johnson Square was developed in 1733. It is Savannah's first and largest square. The Declaration of Independence was read in the square in 1776. And here's the square, and Nathaniel Greene is buried there under this 50-foot obelisk. Now, he was first buried in Colonial Cemetery. And in 1796, his 17-year-old son, George Washington Greene, was buried with him. But Colonial Cemetery was vandalized in the Civil War, and Nathaniel Greene and his son's remains were lost. Well, in 1905, his remains were found in his arch rival's vault, British Lieutenant Colonel John Maitland. Talk about turning around in your grave. Well, as soon as they found him, they moved Greene and his son's grave to Johnson Square underneath the obelisk, as I said. And in 1981, Maitland's bones were moved back to Scotland. Next, we're going to Monterey Square, and we're going to see Casimir Pulaski. He was a count for the Polish Commonwealth, and he was colonel in the cavalry fighting in the Polish Revolution against Russia in 1765 to 1772. He was described as a loose cannon. So the Polish lost against Russia, and he escaped to France. Well, he applied to the French army, he applied to the German army. No army wanted to take him. And in fact, in 1777, the French officials encouraged Benjamin Franklin to take Pulaski to America, and they actually paid for his voyage to the United States. Well, George Washington really didn't even want him either, but Pulaski was dogging George Washington's heel, and he was with that in the Battle of Brandywine, had no official posting at all. But he saw that Washington's army was going to be flanked and destroyed. So he volunteers, he leads 30 mounted guards right into the fray. It is enough to delay the British, and Washington withdrew. Washington is thrilled. Pulaski becomes a British general and is called the Commander of the Horse. He raised and trained a cavalry unit and dressed them in the European style. But Pulaski was vain and arrogant, and his counterparts hated him. So what did they do? Of course, they sent him to the South in 1779 to recover Savannah from the British in the battle or the siege of Savannah. Well, what does he do during the battle? He charges the British, just like Brandywine. But unlike Brandywine, the British are in a fort. And so they shoot him and his men. Pulaski is removed from the field. The grape shot is removed from an American doctor. He doesn't trust Americans. He insists on being boarded to a ship to the north, and he dies on the ship 2 days later of gangrene. The ship still had not left Savannah Harbor. His body is buried outside Savannah. He's 34 years old, and he never got married. Well, they found his remains in 1853. And they buried him in Monterey Square, and by this in this obelisk, and you can see there's a relief of Pulaski here. And in 1996, they're like, let's double check that these bones are really Pulaski's. So they remove the bones, they take the DNA, they send them off to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian, until 2019, doesn't fully say, yes, the wounds match, the bones match, it is a DNA match. They found one of Pulaski's brothers, relatives, and it is a DNA match. What took so long was the Smithsonian found that Pulaski has a woman's skeleton. And they believe he's called what is called intersex, where the internal organs don't match the outside organs. There's a whole really interesting 1-hour presentation on the Smithsonian Channel. It originally aired April 8th, 2019. It's called on Americans' Hidden Stories. It's called The General Was Female. If you can find that, I think you'll really enjoy that. It was really interesting. You can see Pulaski does look very feminine there. Next, we're going to go to Bonaventure Cemetery, right outside Savannah. We're going to see Dr. Noble Wimble Jones. He actually arrived in Georgia with Oglethorpe at the age of 9. He's called the Morning Star of Liberty. And in 1777, he helped write Georgia's Constitution. He fled Savannah to Charleston, and he was captured in Charleston in 1780, was sent to St. Augustine, where he was prisoner. And when he was exchanged in 1781, he immediately went to Philadelphia. He was buried in 1805, originally at Colonial Cemetery, and then when Bonaventure opened up, he was reburied there, and his grave faces his home, which is the Winslow National State Historical Site. Next, we're going to see Edward Telfair. He's also in the Bonaventure Cemetery. He is, by Ranker.com, they list him as the 6th hottest founding father. And look at him, he looks pretty hot, but not as hot as Alexander Hamilton, the number 1. Well, Edward Telfair was not only hot, he was a wealthy merchant and a farmer. And we shouldn't be surprised, he marries a very wealthy woman, Sarah Gibson. Remember, she was the daughter of the multi-millionaire William Gibson, which I spoke of earlier. Edward Telfair was twice governor. And this image of Sarah was probably taken when he was governor. The Telfairs were part of the coastal elite. They were Southerners who felt at ease in drawing rooms, both in New York and Philadelphia, as well as the parlors of Savannah and Charleston. He died in Savannah in 1807, and Sarah died 20 years later in Philadelphia. Both of them were buried at their farm near Savannah. In 1860, their daughter moved all the family members that were buried on the farm to Bonaventure Cemetery, and they are all in this crypt here. Next, we're going to make our way down to Midway. So we're coming down more into our area. We're going to see Dr. Nathan Brownson. Many of you may be familiar with the Midway Cemetery. Don't look for his gravestone there. There is a plaque across the road from the gravestone about him. He was in the First Continental Congress, and surprise, surprise, he was the governor of Georgia. Why were there so many governors of Georgia? Well, there's actually been 77 governors. We're on our 77th governor so far. Well, from 1777 to 1789, the governorship was limited to 1 year. So you had a lot in there. And then after that, it was 2 years until 1868. So from the period of time of these famous revolutionary people that I'm talking about, Georgia actually had 24 governors. And 14 of them are famous from the Revolutionary War and buried in Georgia. There are no famous Revolutionary War people buried in our county, Glenn County. But I did sort of find a connection in Camden County, John Floyd. His father, Charles Floyd, seems here, was actually more involved in the Revolutionary War than John. Charles was captured in 1781, and while he was captured, the Tories burned his home while John and his mother hid in the woods. John ran away in 1783, the last year of the American Revolution, to join the militia. So he did get into the revolution. And in the 1800s, the entire family moved to Camden County. They were shipbuilders, and they were the largest landowners and wealthiest family in Camden County. In 1839, John Floyd died. He requested his body be wrapped in his beloved flag, and he's buried at the Floyd family cemetery. Here's a picture of him. He was a brigadier general in the War of 1812, and his wife, Isabel Hazard. Some of you may be familiar with the Hazards of St. Simon's. She was from South Carolina, but there does seem to be a connection between her Hazards and our St. Simon Hazards. It is a private cemetery. I wasn't able to go in there. It's only open once a year in April to family members for a family reunion. There are 19 graves there. John and 9 others are unmarked. So it's on private land in Union Carbon Road. Now we're going to our last famous revolutionary person buried in Georgia, and it is Henry Lee. Now, if any of you have gone to Cumberland Island, you've probably stopped and seen his grave. He was nicknamed Light Horse Harry Lee. When he was a major. He led a night raid on the British fort in New Jersey, and he captured 158 prisoners. And because of this raid, the British lost control over New Jersey, and he received the Congressional Gold Medal. He was the only officer who wasn't a general to get the medal. In 1812, he was beaten and tortured while helping a friend who opposed the War of 1812. He went to the West Indies to rest and recuperate. He never really recovered. He said, I want to die at home. While on his way home, he only made it as far as Cumberland Island, where he was stopped and he was cared for by Nathaniel and Grady Green's daughter. And she had him buried with full military honors provided by the U.S. fleet from St. Mary's. And here's his grave here. He's right next to Catherine Miller, who was Nathaniel Green's wife, and they're buried in the Green Miller Cemetery. However, in 1913, Virginia asked for his bones to be moved to Virginia. So he's in Lexington, Virginia, with the rest of the Lee family. So his gravestone at Cumberland is just a cenotaph. Well, we really appreciate you taking your time to learn a little bit more about the revolutionary people buried in Georgia, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm going to hand it back to Stacy now.
Linda, thank you so much. That was fabulous. That was really interesting. While I unmute everybody, I'm going to ask you, how did you get all that information together?
Well, first I narrowed it down to the 36 people that were famous in the Revolutionary War buried in Georgia. And then I just started researching them and started taking little day trips and visiting the sites.
How do you track the information? I mean, it must be a lot to put all that together.
Yeah. Well, I do have the degree in the American Revolutionary War. And so I knew a lot of the stuff about them during the Revolutionary War, but I did learn quite a little bit of things about them. And I try to find interesting factoids that other people wouldn't know, that at least I didn't know about them. So, yeah, it was a fun research project.
You definitely did do that. I was really interested in some of those stories, especially Casimir Pulaski, which I've heard about before, but it's always worthwhile hearing about it again. Just fascinating. Does anybody, I've asked people to unmute. Does anybody have questions for Linda? You can either say them or put them into the chat.
Well, I've seen on FindaGrave. I really didn't understand it is free.
It's absolutely free. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because I know I've been on Ancestry and I thought that you'd have to pay for that too.
Nope.
So now I have learned something. Thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Besides about the soldiers and how many governors Georgia had. That's just amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, I believe Ancestry bought FindaGrave, but they left it free. And they're very approachable. I've found recently, Rob Lear had given us some information that is on our website about how to request them to change cemetery information, because I've found some duplicate cemeteries on there. And you just write to their support people and they'll do just about anything for you. If you find information that's wrong, you can reach out directly to the people who make the memorials, but the support people are very proactive, very helpful.
Good.
How reliable is the information on FindaGrave?
Well, it's put in there. So you really do need to fact check it. I would definitely fact check. Now, the famous ones are not held by individuals. They are held by FindaGrave people. They hold them. But I did find a couple of errors on those, and I did send in corrections on those too. But I would double fact check it. But some of them you do, as everything, you take a look at the information and then just double check it. But it is a great resource.
Now, going back a little bit, you said that they have revolutionary, that you can click on a revolutionary list that they have to try to find someone.
I created a virtual cemetery that is of famous revolutionary people buried in Georgia, but they're under FindaGrave, you can go under famous, and they have military people that you can go to. But to find exactly ones that were buried in Georgia, I had to do a date range of people that were born and died and buried in Georgia and famous. So there isn't a category for that specific thing. The closest thing was military leaders.
All right. Okay.
And there's a question, would you know if living descendants have been able to connect to these military revolutionary people?
Well, so you can, on FindaGrave is just for people who are buried. So, but it does show who they are linked to their descendants. So you could work your way down. But it only shows graves, if that answers the question.
Now on that FindaGrave, I have gone to the site because I was researching my ancestry. Mm-hmm. And I did see that they do list some of your relatives, but I noticed on my grandfathers, they only had about 4 of the kids instead of 7.
Okay, well then what you need to do is you just sign into FindaGrave and create a username and password and find the other 3 that they don't have. And then you can ask if they're not there, you can put them in yourself, create the monument yourself. And if they are there, since they are your family, you can ask that person that if you are interested, that they transfer those memorials to you. If they don't, you can ask that they link those memorials to your grandfather, and that's very easy to do. And again, there's a tutorial on FindaGrave that shows you how to do all of this.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Because if it is your direct descendant, like a grandparent, they and the person who holds the memorial is not a direct descendant, they are supposed to transfer that memorial to you.
Okay. Well, I'll find out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions for Linda? Okay. Well, this was a really interesting talk. We'll have the recording of it up on the website. I'll send out an email, and it'll be on the Facebook page. And Linda, we just really thank you for taking the time to share all this information with us. It was so interesting. I really enjoyed the talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and
Okay.
hope to see you next time. We'll send out the note about the May meeting, which I think you'll also find interesting. The Family Search Fellow was, it's a fascinating process.
Okay. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
Linda, could you stay for a minute?
Sure.
You confuse me when you say